2,800 feet above the Quang Tri Highlands. 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, begins its first assault on Hill 881 South, a fortified ridgeline that intelligence reports suggest holds no more than a company of NVA regulars. Within 2 hours, Marine companies are pinned under interlocking fire from bunkers invisible until the moment they open up, and the ridge that was supposed to fall in a single push becomes a killing ground that will demand 5 separate assaults, reshaping the entire approach to the looming siege of Khe Sanh. The hills northwest of Khe Sanh Combat Base rose in steep, jungled folds, each ridgeline a natural fortress. Hill 881 South sat roughly 3.5 miles from the airstrip, part of a cluster of peaks that dominated the approaches to the base and the valleys leading toward Laos. In early 1967, Marine intelligence identified increasing NVA activity around these hills, particularly 881 South and its twin, 881 North. The terrain was brutal. Slopes climbed at angles exceeding 30 degrees, covered in double canopy jungle and elephant grass that concealed movement until contact was made at ranges often under 50 feet. For the Marines of the 3rd Regiment, tasked with clearing the high ground before the monsoon season locked the region in fog and rain, the mission seemed straightforward: sweep the hills, destroy any NVA positions, deny the enemy observation over Khe Sanh. The operational plan, developed at regimental headquarters, allocated 3 rifle companies to the assault, with artillery and air support on call. Commanders estimated the operation would take 2 to 3 days at most, assuming standard resistance patterns observed in earlier sweeps along the DMZ. 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, moved out on April 24th with companies I, K, and M in column, climbing toward 881 South from the southeast. The battalion had been in country for months, rotating through patrols and sweeps along the DMZ. But this operation, codenamed Prairie, marked a shift toward larger, more deliberate actions. Each rifle company carried standard combat loads: M16 rifles, M60 machine guns with 600-round basic loads, M79 grenade launchers, and enough ammunition for a day's fight. Supporting arms included 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned at Khe Sanh, with pre-plotted fire missions covering the likely avenues of approach. The 105mm guns could fire high explosive rounds out to approximately 6.8 miles, while the heavier 155mm pieces reached targets beyond 9 miles. Air support stood ready at Da Nang and Chu Lai, with F-4 Phantoms and A-4 Skyhawks on strip alert, able to reach the target area in under 20 minutes. The plan assumed that once the Marines closed with the enemy, superior firepower and maneuver would break any resistance within hours. Battalion intelligence estimated enemy strength at company level, perhaps 150 to 200 fighters, based on radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance. The first sign of trouble came not from direct fire, but from the absence of it. As the lead elements of Company I pushed through the lower slopes, they encountered no probing fire, no hasty ambushes, none of the usual harassment that marked NVA contact. The jungle remained silent except for the rustle of gear and the labored breathing of Marines hauling themselves uphill in humidity that topped 90%. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, leading the point squad, had 3 months of DMZ patrols behind him and knew the rhythm of enemy contact. The silence felt wrong. Then, at approximately 10:30 a.m., as his squad crested a small saddle 600 feet below the summit, the hillside erupted. Machine gun fire raked the column from concealed bunkers dug into the reverse slope, positions invisible from below, and reinforced with logs and earth thick enough to shrug off rifle fire and grenades. Rodriguez went down in the first burst, hit twice in the chest. Mortar rounds began falling with precision, walking up and down the trail, cutting off the lead platoon from support. The volume of fire suggested not a company but a reinforced battalion, with automatic weapons positioned in depth and overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach. Within minutes, Company I had taken a dozen casualties and the advance ground to a halt. The NVA had turned 881 South into a prepared defensive complex. Bunkers were sited in depth, each covering the approaches to the next, with interlocking fields of fire that left no dead ground. The positions were not hasty fighting holes but engineered fortifications, some with overhead cover exceeding 3 feet of packed earth and timber, proof against anything short of a direct hit from heavy artillery or bombs. The defenders, later identified as elements of the 325 CNVA Division, had spent weeks preparing the position, stockpiling ammunition and supplies carried down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had studied the terrain, anticipated the likely Marine axes of advance, and built a defense that forced attackers into narrow kill zones where firepower mattered more than numbers. For the Marines, trained in fire and maneuver, the reality was immediate. Movement drew fire, and fire came from positions that could not be suppressed without closing to grenade range. The bunkers incorporated firing ports that limited exposure while maximizing coverage, and many were connected by trenches that allowed defenders to shift position without exposing themselves to observation or direct fire. Company I's first assault stalled within an hour. The lead platoon, pinned under fire, called for artillery. The 105 mm howitzers at Khe Sanh responded with high explosive rounds, but the jungle canopy absorbed much of the fragmentation, and the bunkers themselves were too well built to collapse under indirect fire alone. F-4 Phantoms arrived overhead, rolling in with 500-pound bombs and napalm, but the close proximity of Marine positions and the thick vegetation made target identification difficult. Pilots reported secondary explosions and probable hits, yet when the smoke cleared, the bunkers resumed firing. By mid-afternoon, Company I had taken casualties and pulled back to reorganize. The battalion commander, assessing the situation, ordered a second assault for the following morning, this time with 2 companies abreast and heavier preparatory fires. The day's fighting had cost the Marines 15 killed and over 30 wounded, numbers that exceeded losses from any single engagement in the previous month. Marine intelligence estimated NVA losses at perhaps 20 to 30 based on observed hits and blood trails, but the enemy position remained intact. That night, the NVA reinforced. Patrols reported movement along the trails leading north toward 881 north and west toward the Laotian border, suggesting that the defenders were not isolated, but part of a larger network. Marine listening posts heard digging, the sound of logs being dragged, voices calling softly in Vietnamese. The enemy was not withdrawing, they were deepening the position. At dawn on April 25th, the Marines launched their second assault. Companies I and K advanced under a rolling barrage, 155 mm shells impacting 200 feet ahead of the lead squads, lifting as the infantry closed. This time, the plan called for a flanking movement. Company K would push up a narrow draw on the western slope, while Company 1 fixed the enemy frontally. The NVA waited until the Marines were within 100 feet, then opened fire. The flanking company ran into pre-sighted mortar fire that turned the draw into a kill zone, forcing the Marines to ground among rocks and fallen trees. Again, the assault stalled. Machine guns, RPGs, and rifle fire shredded the vegetation. Casualties mounted. Medevac helicopters, UH-1 Hueys, braved ground fire to extract the wounded, but the landing zones were under direct observation, and several birds took hits. One Huey struck in the tail rotor, auto-rotated into a clearing 500 feet downslope. Crew Chief Corporal Danny Hayes stayed at his M60, laying suppressive fire while the pilot brought the bird down hard. Marines from a nearby platoon reached the crash site within minutes, pulling out 3 wounded and the shaken crew before NVA mortar rounds began bracketing the wreck. The pattern evolved over the next 3 days. Each assault began with artillery and airstrikes. Each advance pushed closer to the summit, and each time the NVA defense adapted. The third assault, on April 26th, saw Marines bring up flamethrowers, man-portable M2A1 units with a range of roughly 65 feet. The weapons were devastating in theory, but the jungle's humidity and the bunker's depth limited their effectiveness. Operators had to close to within 50 feet, exposing themselves to rifle fire, and even direct hits often failed to penetrate the thickest positions. One flamethrower team, led by Lance Corporal Stevens, managed to burn out a bunker on the northern approach, only to come under fire from a second position 40 feet away. Stevens took a round through the shoulder but kept his team moving, directing them to cover, while he crawled back for a resupply of fuel canisters. By the fourth assault, on April 28th, the battalion had rotated companies, brought in engineers with demolitions, and coordinated airstrikes with forward air controllers orbiting in O-1 bird dogs at 3,500 feet. Engineers attempted to breach the bunker line with satchel charges and shape charges, crawling forward under covering fire to place explosives against log walls. Some bunkers collapsed, but the trench network allowed NVA fighters to reoccupy positions after dark, rebuilding firing ports and resupplying ammunition from caches hidden in the reverse slopes. Marine commanders began to speak of 881 South not as a hill, but as a fortress, a position that could only be taken through attrition and the systematic destruction of every defensive work. Intelligence estimates now placed NVA casualties at over 100, but the defense showed no signs of breaking. The fifth assault, launched on April 30th, was not a single coordinated push but a series of small unit actions, each squad and platoon fighting its own battle against a specific bunker or trench line. The Marines had abandoned the idea of a rapid breakthrough and settled into the grim arithmetic of attrition. Every bunker had to be located, fixed with suppressive fire, flanked if possible, and destroyed with explosives. The NVA, for their part, fought with discipline and patience, falling back only when a position became untenable, then reoccupying it after dark if the Marines could not hold the ground. The result was a battle measured in yards per day, with casualties accumulating on both sides. Marine rifle squads, normally 13 men, were down to 8 or 9 effectives after days of fighting. Replacements arrived by helicopter, young Marines fresh from training who had to learn the rhythm of combat under fire. Private First Class James Kowalski, 19 years old and in country for 2 weeks, joined Company K on the morning of April 30th. His squad leader, a lance corporal with a month's seniority, showed him how to move between cover without silhouetting against the sky, how to identify bunker positions by the sound of return fire, how to conserve ammunition during suppressive bursts. Kowalski learned fast, because the alternative was dying in the first contact. Supporting arms became the critical variable. The 105mm howitzers at Khe Sanh fired over 3,000 rounds during the 5 assaults, their tubes heating to the point where crews had to pause to let them cool. The 155mm batteries added another 1,500 rounds, some using variable time fuses that detonated above the canopy, showering the hillside with shrapnel. Airstrikes delivered an estimated 200 tons of ordnance, including napalm canisters that burned through the undergrowth and high-drag bombs designed to crater bunker complexes. Yet the effectiveness of this firepower was constrained by the terrain and the proximity of friendly forces. Pilots had to identify targets visually, often through smoke and haze, and release ordnance within narrow windows to avoid hitting Marine positions. Forward air controllers, circling overhead, became the link between ground and air, talking pilots onto targets with smoke rockets and verbal descriptions. The coordination required split-second timing and clear communication, often conducted over radios crackling with static and competing transmissions from multiple units engaged across the hillside. One FAC mission on April 29th illustrated the challenge. Captain James Wilkins, flying an O-1 at 4,000 feet, received a call from a Marine Company commander pinned on the northern slope of 881 South. The company had located a bunker complex but could not advance without air support. Wilkins descended to 2,500 feet, marking the target with a white phosphorus rocket, then directed a flight of two A-4 Skyhawks onto the position. The first pass missed by 100 feet, the bombs impacting upslope. Wilkins adjusted, bringing the second aircraft in from a different angle, talking the pilot through the final approach with reference to terrain features and the smoke still drifting from the first strike. The 500-pound bomb hit directly, collapsing part of the bunker line. The Marines advanced, took the position, and found 3 destroyed bunkers and evidence of at least a dozen NVA killed. But the next bunker, 75 feet away, opened fire within minutes, and the process began again. Wilkins remained on station for another 2 hours, directing 3 more strikes before fuel constraints forced him to return to base. His after-action report noted that the NVA had constructed bunkers in clusters, each cluster mutually supporting, requiring multiple strikes to neutralize. He estimated that his sorties had destroyed or damaged 8 bunkers and killed perhaps 20 to 30 defenders. But the overall defensive network remained functional. The NVA defense relied on more than just bunkers. Mortar teams, positioned on the reverse slopes and in the valleys, provided indirect fire that interdicted Marine supply lines and landing zones. The mortars, likely 82mm models, had a range of roughly 2 miles and could drop rounds with accuracy honed by weeks of pre-registered fire missions. Marine counter-battery fire, directed by radar and sound-ranging equipment, destroyed some of these positions, but others displaced after firing and survived. The result was a constant threat that forced the Marines to move supplies forward under fire and limited the use of helicopters during daylight hours. NVA mortar crews operated with discipline, firing short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds before displacing, making them difficult targets for counter-battery radar. The Marines adapted by scheduling resupply flights during brief windows when airstrikes suppressed enemy fire, but the risk remained high, and every helicopter mission was a calculated gamble. By the end of April, Marine intelligence estimated that NVA mortar fire had caused roughly 30% of Marine casualties on 881 South, a proportion that underscored the effectiveness of indirect fire in mountain warfare. Logistics became a battle within the battle. Each Marine on the line consumed ammunition, water, and rations at rates that exceeded initial estimates. Resupply helicopters, primarily CH-46 Sea Knights, flew multiple sorties daily, landing on improvised zones carved out of the jungle by engineers with chainsaws and explosives. The zones were small, often no more than 60 feet across, and surrounded by trees that limited approach angles. Pilots had to descend vertically, hover while crews offloaded supplies and loaded casualties, then climb out under the threat of ground fire. Several helicopters were damaged, and one CH-46 was shot down on April 27th, killing 4 crew members. The Marines on 881 South learned to ration water and ammunition, knowing that the next resupply might be hours or a day away. Water became particularly critical, with each Marine requiring at least 2 quarts per day in the heat and humidity, but carrying capacity limited what could be brought forward. Some squads resorted to collecting rainwater in ponchos, boiling it over heat tabs to kill bacteria. By the morning of May 2nd, the cumulative weight of 5 assaults had broken the NVA defense. The Marines held the summit of 881 South, though the cost had been severe. Over 150 casualties, including more than 40 killed. The NVA had withdrawn during the night of May 1st, leaving behind destroyed bunkers, expended ammunition, and a handful of bodies. Patrols found evidence that the defenders had evacuated wounded and dead under cover of darkness, a disciplined retrograde that preserved the unit's cohesion. Marine intelligence, piecing together reports from the 5 days of fighting, estimated NVA losses at between 200 and 250 killed and wounded, a figure derived from observed casualties, blood trails, and the volume of fire sustained over the course of the battle. The ridge was secured, but the fight had revealed lessons that would shape the coming siege of Khe Sanh. Prepared defenses in rugged terrain could absorb enormous firepower and hold against determined assaults. Victory required not just courage, but patience, coordination, and the willingness to pay the price in time and blood. Engineers who surveyed the captured positions counted over 60 bunkers, many interconnected by trenches, with stockpiles of ammunition that suggested the NVA had planned to hold the hill for weeks or months. The battle for Hill 881 South was not an isolated action but part of a larger pattern. In the weeks that followed, Marines assaulted and took Hill 881 North and Hill 861, each fight echoing the same dynamics: entrenched defenders, difficult terrain, heavy supporting fires, and grinding small unit combat. The NVA, for their part, demonstrated that they could contest ground even against superior firepower, using terrain and fortifications to offset American advantages in mobility and air support. The hills around Khe Sanh became a proving ground for both sides, a preview of the siege that would begin in January 1968. Intelligence reports later revealed that the 325C Division had orders to hold the hills as long as possible, inflicting maximum casualties and delaying the Marine advance. The division succeeded in its mission, buying time for other NVA units to position themselves for the larger campaign to come. On the summit of 881 South, Marines dug in among the shattered bunkers, setting up observation posts and machine gun positions. They could see 881 North to the northwest, another ridgeline bristling with fortifications, and beyond it the haze-shrouded valleys leading into Laos. The war was not over. It was only beginning. The capture of 881 South forced a reassessment of Marine tactics in the northern provinces. Battalion commanders gathered at Khe Sanh in mid-May, walking the captured positions, studying the bunker construction and the fields of fire. They saw how the NVA had used reverse slopes to hide positions from aerial observation, how trenches linked bunkers into a network that could not be destroyed piecemeal, how pre-registered mortar fire turned every landing zone into a kill zone. The initial assumption that aggressive maneuver and firepower could quickly dislodge NVA forces had been tested and found wanting. The enemy had adapted, building defenses that required methodical reduction rather than rapid assault. Marine commanders began to emphasize combined arms coordination, integrating infantry, artillery, air support, and engineers into cohesive packages designed to suppress, fix, and destroy fortified positions. The lessons were tactical but also operational. Holding ground required continuous resupply and reinforcement, and the NVA could interdict supply lines with mortars and ambushes if given the opportunity. Training programs at division level were updated to include instruction on bunker assault techniques, emphasizing the use of satchel charges, flamethrowers, and close coordination with supporting arms. Squads practiced the sequence: suppress with machine gun fire, maneuver to the flank, destroy with explosives, consolidate and prepare for counterattack. The technical challenge of close air support in mountainous, jungled terrain prompted changes in procedures. Forward air controllers received additional training in target marking and communication, and pilots practiced low-altitude deliveries that increased accuracy at the cost of exposure to ground fire. The use of napalm, effective in clearing vegetation and suppressing bunkers, became more common, though its application required careful coordination to avoid friendly casualties. High-drag bombs, which allowed aircraft to release ordnance at lower altitudes without risking blast damage to the delivery platform, became standard for strikes near Marine positions. These adjustments, incremental and hard-won, improved the effectiveness of air support, but could not eliminate the fundamental friction of combat in terrain that favored the defender. Pilots reported that the jungle canopy often obscured targets until the last moment, requiring multiple passes to confirm hits. Some FACs began using colored smoke grenades in addition to white phosphorus rockets, providing pilots with clearer visual references in the dense vegetation. The changes were documented in tactical bulletins distributed across I Corps, each lesson paid for in blood, on hills like 881 South. Artillery tactics also evolved. The Marines increased the use of variable time fuses, which detonated shells above the ground, creating airburst effects that penetrated jungle canopy more effectively than impact fuses. Fire missions were planned in greater depth, with concentrations designed to isolate bunker complexes and prevent reinforcement. Counter-battery fire, directed by radar and aerial observation, became a priority, targeting NVA mortar and artillery positions before they could disrupt Marine operations. The howitzer crews at Khe Sanh, working around the clock, developed techniques for rapid fire and sustained bombardment, pushing their guns to the limits of endurance. Barrel wear became a concern, with some tubes fired so frequently that rifling degraded, reducing accuracy. Maintenance crews rotated barrels when possible, but the operational tempo often left little time for anything beyond basic cleaning and lubrication. The artillerymen understood that their fire was the difference between a successful assault and a bloodbath, and they pushed themselves and their equipment accordingly. The NVA, observing the Marine response, drew their own conclusions. The defense of 881 South had delayed the Americans for a week, inflicted significant casualties, and demonstrated that prepared positions could withstand heavy bombardment. These lessons informed the planning for the siege of Khe Sanh, where the NVA would surround the base with bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions designed to endure months of air and ground assault. The hills taken in April and May 1967 became part of the defensive perimeter when the siege began. Their slopes scarred by the earlier fighting, their ridgelines, now held by Marines who understood the cost of every foot of ground. NVA commanders circulated reports on the effectiveness of deep bunkers and interlocking fields of fire, recommending similar construction techniques for future defensive positions. The 325C Division's performance on 881 South became a case study within NVA training programs, cited as an example of how to fight a delaying action against a technologically superior opponent. The division had lost heavily, perhaps a quarter of its strength, but it had accomplished its mission and preserved its cohesion, withdrawing in good order to fight again. For the individual Marines who fought on 881 South, the battle left memories of exhaustion, fear, and the slow, brutal work of reducing fortified positions. Squads that had started the assault at full strength ended with half their number, the rest evacuated or killed. The survivors spoke of the weight of gear on steep slopes, the crack of AK-47 fire from bunkers that seemed to materialize out of the jungle, the smell of cordite and napalm, the sound of helicopters overhead. They spoke, too, of small victories, a bunker destroyed, a position held, a wounded Marine carried to safety. The battle was not cinematic but incremental, a series of small actions that added up to a strategic outcome. Letters home described the terrain, the heat, the difficulty of moving under fire, but often omitted the details of combat itself, those experiences reserved for conversations with fellow veterans years later. Sergeant Rodriguez, wounded in the first assault, survived and returned to his unit in June, carrying scars and a Purple Heart. Private Kowalski, the replacement who joined on the fifth assault, became a squad leader by the time of the Khe Sanh siege, passing on the lessons he had learned in those 5 days on the ridge. Hill 881 South stood as a monument to the nature of the Vietnam War in the northern provinces. It was a fight without front lines, where terrain and fortifications mattered more than numbers, and where victory required not just firepower, but the willingness to close with an enemy who would not break easily. The Marines who took the ridge in May 1967 had proven that American forces could prevail in mountain warfare, but the cost and the time required underscored the limits of conventional tactics in an unconventional war. The lessons learned on that ridgeline, written in blood and earth, would echo through the siege of Khe Sanh and beyond, shaping the way the war was fought and remembered. On the summit of 881 South, Among charred bunker logs and shell craters already filling with rainwater, Marines rebuilt the same positions, now for themselves. They dug fighting holes in the red clay, strung concertina wire along the perimeter, and stacked sandbags against the coming monsoon. They did not know that in 9 months, NVA artillery would pound these same slopes, that the bunkers they now occupied would shelter them through 77 days of siege, or that the hill they had taken at such cost would become a cornerstone of the defense that defined Khe Sanh. They knew only that the ridge was theirs and that they would hold it. Stories like this remind us that war isn't just about dates and numbers. It's about people, the split-second decisions that shaped entire battles. Every flight, every firefight, every tactic is a piece of a massive puzzle where one order could decide the fate of hundreds. We bring back these forgotten moments to show that behind every report and archive page stood real men, pilots, scouts, engineers, soldiers, whose courage and ingenuity changed the course of war, even if their names were never written in textbooks. Tell us in the comments, what moment of the Vietnam War impressed you the most? Or what operation should we cover next? Your ideas keep these stories alive. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us uncover more forgotten chapters where history lives through those who fought it.